Sari Mitnick, and this is Seamwork Radio, where we tell stories about the surprising ways that sewing impacts our lives. Welcome back to Seamwork Radio, everyone. Today we're talking about what affects our feelings and expectations about fit. And we're going to cover some of the roots behind our fit insecurities and then a few tips about how to overcome them. So I'm going to start by asking you our icebreaker for today, Haley, which is, are you obsessive about fitting?
You know what? I think it really depends on the garment. If I'm making something that's like a really special piece that I know is going to stay in my closet for a long time, I definitely go the extra mile. But I feel like I also don't like when I get in that obsessive mindset and it keeps me from making things that I like. So I kind of choose my battles, I guess would be my response. What about you?
Yeah, I guess I feel the same way. I definitely don't think I'm obsessive about fitting. And I say that because, I see people out there who are very obsessive about it. Maybe obsessive is not the right word, but very concerned with it to the point that it really holds them back in enjoying their sewing. And I don't feel like I fall into that camp. I want things that fit well. I also tend to wear, these days, I feel like I wear more loose fitting things than I used to. When I was younger, I used to like very fitted things and, more vintage styles and things like that. And today I do wear more knits and more kind of loose, comfy clothing, especially in the last year and a half. So that probably has some influence on it too. I'm curious how other people feel, like if they feel like they're really obsessive about it, or if that concern with fitting really feels like just part of the process and something they actually enjoy about it.
Yeah, I think that this spectrum of fit focus really leads us in to the topic that we're going to be discussing today. So this month here at Seamwork, we're launching a new class called Fit with Confidence, taught by me. If you want to learn how to fit with confidence, go on over to Seamwork, check it out. But this class is meant to be an introduction to fitting, and it's going to kick off the addition of fit videos to the Seamwork classroom. Prior to now, we've been really sewing focused, and we really wanted to help people overcome their fit insecurities. And from now on, we're going to be frequently adding some more fit resources. And fit, time and time again, is this big topic that comes up in sewing, and rightfully so, because it's complicated and it's different for every single person because we all have totally unique bodies. And so when my teammates and I were tasked with the creation of this class, we had a lot of discussions about the feelings that we have about fit in our bodies and the expectations we had when it came to the fit of our clothing. And something that we realized is that ready to wear really hugely impacts not just our feelings about our bodies, which we all know when we discuss often, but also our expectations about the way that clothing fits. Mm-hmm. So that's kind of the crux of, the issue.
Yeah. So tell me a little bit more about that. How do you think ready wear influences our expectations around fit?
I think it does it in a few different ways. One thing that I noticed this a lot when I was teaching in-person classes, and that now in current ready-to-wear knits and really stretchy clothes have, kind of taken over. And so I think that a lot of people have this expectation that non-stretch clothing can fit in the way that stretch clothing can. And I think for that reason, ease can be this really hard thing for a beginner garment sewer to wrap their head around, and that you need ease in a garment to move, and finding that right balance so that you can get that form-fitting look without not being able to move. So I think that was one thing that really struck me when I first started teaching. And I think it gives people this expectation that their clothing can look kind of painted on. And it can't. It's just not humanly possible. I think that there's also this expectation of people are really comfortable critiquing themselves.
Mm-hmm.
I know I'm more comfortable critiquing myself than I am others. So I think that people don't look at ready to wear with the same critical eye that they look at their own creations.
Yeah, I think that's definitely true. And what you were saying about stretch, I've seen that as well, not just with knits, but also our woven garments tend to have a lot of stretch in them these days in ready to wear.
Uh-huh.
And so something like a pair of jeans, it's difficult to find a pair of women's jeans that don't have stretch in them these days.
Mm-hmm.
And if you're sewing a pair of pants, maybe it's a pair of jeans, or maybe it's just another pair of pants that you want to be fitted, it's difficult to get that same look and that same ease of movement and the same, kind of fit if you don't actually have stretch in your fabric as well.
I think another thing that's really interesting is that ready to wear in some ways allows us to like disconnect from our bodies in a weird way, where you don't necessarily have to like sit there and take detailed measurements of yourself. You can just like walk into the Gap and grab like a handful of sizes and blindly try them on and then buy the one that fits. But when you sew, you have to like take out that tape measure and take a bunch of measurements and then be really honest with yourself about them. And I think, that's obviously the first thing you can do to get well-fitting garments is take real measurements, not like suck it in measurements.
Yeah. Yeah, that's true. You're kind of starting from the bottom up when you're sewing. You're not,
Mm-hmm.
starting at an end point and trying on a whole bunch of endpoints. You're starting from the very beginning. And I think that's something that I've also noticed with the expectations around ready to wear and fit. It's not just that, but that when a ready to wear garment is produced, it's trialed many, many, many times before it gets to market. And
Mm-hmm.
the fabric is tested as well. So when it comes to market, they know that this fabric with this, particular pattern is going to produce this specific size and look. But when you're starting from the beginning with sewing, you don't really know how your pattern and your fabric are going to interact. And you're not going to be trying a bunch of different fabrics. You're not going to be trialing it many, many times over the course of, a few months, weeks, depending. So it's a little bit different, and the process is a little bit different, I think. And there are some things that you have to just think about differently.
Totally. Sari, how do you look at fit differently now that you sew?
I've been sewing for a long time, and I feel, it's hard because when I started sewing, I was a teenager, so I have a very different relationship with fit and with my body than I probably did when I was 16. So that's hard to say, but I do think that my attitude towards how clothing fit has evolved over time, and that sewing has been a part of that. One of the things that I just remember this when I was first learning to sew, and I was making a dress from this vintage 70s pattern, and I tried it on, and there's this big like bulge in the back of fabric and where the zipper was. And I thought, why do I always get this bulge? Like, why does this always, like, I'm always experiencing this? Like, what's wrong with my body? And then I suddenly realized, well, I can just change that. If I'm having the same problem over and over, I can just know that I can adjust the patterns. I'm very short-waisted. And so just knowing this for some reason wasn't enough. Like, I had to actually get to this point where I had experienced this problem with making clothing over and over and realize, oh, well, I can just, pinch out an inch and shorten everything by an inch in the bodice. And all of a sudden it's sitting on my waist again and I'm not getting this big bulge. So I feel like, I know it sounds really silly that it took me, a while to realize that, but I think that's, I think it's a good example of how sewing can really make you think a little bit differently about your body and the way clothing fits on your body and what's the real problem here? The problem isn't you. The problem is the clothing, right? And you can change that when you sew. It's very empowering, I think. What about you?
I started sewing when I was a teenager, but I didn't start sewing for myself until I was in my 20s. And I had this like weird impression that like there were so many things that like didn't look good on me. And I think this is like, growing up in the cult of like late 90s, early 2000s and very like toxic body image culture. So I had this especially around like fitted bodices. I was like, oh no, I'm busty. Like I can't wear that. And then one of the first things that I decided to make myself was this, just like a really simple dress. It was just like a fitted bodice and a little like dirndl skirt on it. And I was like, tried it on after like, I made a muslin and did all the things you're supposed to do. I tried on the finished thing and zipped it up and I was like, oh, dang, I look good. Why did I think that was like, why did I think that this was like some like, I don't know, style that was like, I couldn't wear. And I've since very much like healed my relationship with the word flattering, but it looked good. And so I just think that it like you, it kind of, I was always in the mindset of like, my body is the issue instead of just, and it's not even the clothing that's the issue. The clothing is manufactured to fit an median kind of body type, but they're making a lot of assumptions. And most of our bodies are not going to fit those assumptions. And when we're sewing, we can make those like little tweaks. Sarah can make her bodice a little bit shorter. I can make the bust a little bit fuller. And then we can have these things that are like beautiful love notes to ourselves and our bodies.
That's a great way of putting it. I think being able to make something to fit your body in the way that you prefer is such a way to express love for yourself and, give yourself the time and attention that your body really deserves. I think it's really a sweet way of putting it. So do you ever feel like getting a really good fit or working on fit holds you back from the enjoyment of sewing? Because I do see that a lot. I see people who get really frustrated with the fact that they can't seem to get the fit that they desire when they're making something.
I think that I have definitely got stuck in that rut before of, obsessing over the crotch of a pair of pants and like 5 muslins later feeling like I, lost the plot somewhere that I like sat down to have fun and do something like, good for my spirit and my mind. And then I'm like cursing in front of the mirror. And I'm like, oh my gosh, no. So I definitely have done that. But that's when I usually try and like put the project down and go back to like a tried and true pattern. And I just have such limited sewing time. And even as like I would consider myself an expert sewer, and like I'm a good pattern maker. It's hard for me to give myself these compliments. I'm like, I'm a good pattern maker. I'm a good sewer. And I even get stuck on fit issues sometimes. And that's when I like urge myself, and I urge anyone listening here today is just like, put it down, come back to it, do something that makes you feel good. Sometimes I'll like put a muslin on that I'd made like a few months before, even a couple weeks before. And I'm like, why did I hate this so much? Like, it's just maybe like my mindset that particular day. And I just like never want to let like perfect stop me from making things I like. So I try not to get hung up on it. What about you?
I feel like I have definitely in the past. I think more often when I'm making my own pattern or drafting a pattern, because that just requires so many iterations, and especially if you're doing something like a fitted pair of pants or, just anything fitted really, but I think it's especially true for pants. It can be frustrating because you make one change and then it has the cascading effect, and, you have to just try it over and over and over again sometimes. So that, I think, that can be frustrating. I would say that I haven't had that experience in quite a long time, though. I don't feel like I get too hung up on those little details. I just try to, like you, I just try to enjoy my sewing time because it's my fun time. And I don't think you have to be, if you're just doing it as your you're embrace the imperfect, I say, you're not your livelihood doesn't depend on this. Your family doesn't depend on this. This is something you're doing just for fun and for your own enjoyment and to give yourself a little gift of time and attention. And so, don't hold yourself to some out there standard that you're never going to meet. This is your hobby.
Yeah. I think that it's like something that we find unacceptable, like, in other parts of our lives to like hold ourselves to like really high standards. And when it comes to sewing, I think like embracing that same mentality of like, doing your best and it'll probably be better next time.
Yeah, definitely. I think it's hard for people because a lot of people come to sewing because they want their clothing to fit better. And that's a big motivator for why they're sewing in the first place. And so if you feel like you're not doing well at that, then that could be really, really frustrating. So I think that's understandable, but like all things, it requires a sense of balance. And, you have to balance that desire to have this outcome that you want with your desire to just enjoy the time you're spending with yourself. So I don't know, maybe just take a step back if you feel like you're getting a little bit too far to one side of that spectrum or another, and, kind of think about why you're doing this in the first place. And maybe if it's not just about getting the best fitting garment possible.
Yeah, totally. I mean, and all of that being said, I feel like we like really started this episode off by being like, doesn't need to be perfect. And we don't want to invalidate your feelings about pursuing a great fit. And that's why we've like started this whole like kind of initiative here at Seamwork, is to like really help our fellow seam workers overcome those fitting fears and give you some like really awesome tools in your tool belt. But it all starts with mindset. So I'm going to jump in with some tips because my first one is a mindset tip. And that tip is don't let perfect be the enemy of good. I think that letting go of this idea of perfection, not letting our clothing be another, like our self-made clothing be another way that we have like an opportunity to critique our body. Our bodies, they move, and so do our clothes. There's like no such thing as a like wrinkleless garment. I think I see lots of people obsessing over like, oh, but there's this wrinkle right here. I'm like, yeah, that's because your one shoulder is like hitched up on your hip, or like, you have your arm on your hip, or your clothes are going to move along with your body, and not all wrinkles are bad. You want to like look for those things that are like truly uncomfortable or look like maybe bad from like all angles, all movements.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
I think another big tip is examining the clothing that you love. Find the things in your closet that are like close and fit to what you're trying to achieve, and examine them. Examine the fabric. Fabric has a huge impact on how our garments fit. Is it a twill weave? A twill's gonna like move and shift and mold to your body a little bit more effortlessly. So maybe when you make the same thing out of a canvas, it won't have the same effect. Take measurements of that garment, compare the ease to your body measurements. I mean, like really like take that garment and put it under a microscope.
Yeah, I think this was really, really helpful to me when I was first learning to sew, is kind of looking at what I already have and wore a lot and fit me in a way that I preferred, and transferring that into the clothing that I made, and understanding, okay, well, I like things to be loose in this area and I like things to be fitted in this area. And, how can I replicate that in the things that I'm making as well?
Yeah. And finding, patterns that are designed with similar amounts of ease and similar kind of features is really important. I think I see a lot of people doing this where they're like, oh, well, I want to make a workwear jacket like the Rut jacket, but I want it to be super fitted. So I'm going to go down 3 sizes. So there's like, no ease. And like you mentioned before, fit has like this cascading effect. So yeah, you might get less ease across your body. You're also going to get a tighter armhole. And, you may end up at the end of the day not being able to feel your fingertips. And so instead, being like really realistic, looking at the pattern C's, and you can go up a size or down a size and kind of, you have some play in there, but shopping for patterns that are, inspired by the ones that you love will really save you, I think, a lot of grief and of transforming things. When you get beyond that point, you're not like making pattern adjustments, you're pattern making. You're like trying to reinvent the wheel. So if you find yourself really frustrated and running into walls a lot, maybe ask yourself, am I making pattern adjustments or am I pattern making here?
Yeah. Yeah. I think I'm glad you brought up outerwear, because I think that's, I saw a thread on the Seamwork community recently about whether you should try things on with like the undergarments that you're planning to wear. And I think, that, the consensus on the community was yes, definitely. But I also think with things like outerwear, you have to think about what are you going to be wearing under this outerwear? If you were doing something like the red jacket and you want it to be super fitted, well, are you going to be able to wear, a sweater underneath it if that's what you would typically wear underneath it? Are you going to be able to layer in the way that you want? Are you going to, what are you going to be wearing under your garment as well? Because I think that also is another thing that affects the fit. And I think that's another way that looking at the clothing you already have and how you wear it can be really, really helpful when you're thinking about how you want your clothing to fit.
Totally. When we're fitting outerwear at Seamwork, we almost always fit with like at least like a light sweater underneath, because I think there's just, especially if it's maybe a little different if it's like a light jacket for spring or something. But if we're designing like, a lined coat for fall, then we definitely like set the models up with like a sweatshirt and make sure that like, we don't want people freezing. That's no good. That's not good design. My third tip for you is to really differentiate your feelings about fit and your feelings about your body. I think this is like a really tough one. Are you obsessing over the fit of, pant legs? Are you obsessing over maybe something that you don't like about your thighs? And I see this a lot when I'm answering questions or helping people out, is that they're like, oh, well, how do I make this look so that you can't, so my legs, so it's fitted, but my legs don't look too thin, or, some other like, well, you can't, because that's just like, if you have slender legs, that's just part of your body, and no fitted pant is going to
change that.
I hate that word. Like, it's not going to change that. So if you're freaking out over something and getting into that really, like, especially if the mindset starts shifting from curious about the way something works or how to make it better and shifts into that like obsessive realm, I think it's just a question to ask yourself. Am I obsessing over the garment, or am I obsessing over my body?
Yeah. I think, that's something I've definitely struggled with, because I have a lot of asymmetry in my body. And, that's not something that is generally judged to be desirable in, in society. And so it's hard not to approach fitting those asymmetries with any kind of judgment about them. It's something I've learned to do over the years, but I think that's something that's, things like that are generally, they might be considered quote unquote flaws in terms of beauty, or in terms of, our beauty standards. But I think learning to see them not as flaws, but as just as variations in the human population that are totally normal and totally natural is such a much healthier way of looking at it. It's something that I think sewing can help you come to terms with. It might take a while, but it can help you come to terms with that.
Yeah, definitely. I think another big tip that I have for people is kind of choosing your school of thought on fitting. There's so many methods out there. There's like tissue fitting. There's like more like pattern making focus type things where you're thinking in more of an X and Y axis. And then there's things like, full bust adjustments and, broad shoulder adjustments. And I just would like to note that I knew when I learned pattern making and I took 4 years worth of pattern making in college, I never once heard of these adjustments. I was like doing them in theory. I was like, oh yeah, if someone has a fuller bust, if I'm working with a client with a fuller bust, they need more armhole coverage and they need more shaping and they need more fullness. And I was achieving all of those things, but I wasn't calling it a full bust adjustment. I was just like, yeah, just making clothes for boobs. But I think now with the internet and the sewing community, all of these different schools of thought and like methods are right there at your fingertips. And I think that like choosing one that makes sense to your brain and kind of sticking to that and like really exploring that is a really good way to like remove the noise. It's not to say that any of those methods are wrong or one's better than the other, but like check them out. And one might just like click with you a little bit more.
Yeah, some people work better with flat pattern adjustments and some people like draping and actually like seeing things in a more three-dimensional space in order to figure out what adjustments in it. I don't think one is right or wrong. It's just different ways of going about it.
Yeah. And I think like, we all just like think so differently, and finding the one that like makes sense to you, just do that. Like, don't try and like fight your brain's natural like thought patterns and tendencies. Go with that. And if you need help figuring that out, figuring out your fitting style, be sure to listen to the next couple weeks of Seamwork Radio, because we're going to be talking about things like how to jumpstart your fitting journey. And then also in 2 weeks from now, we're going to be covering our favorite fit resources. So yeah, be sure to pop back on and listen to those if you are wanting to kind of jump into your fitting journey.
Yeah, that's going to be, I'm looking forward to doing those. I think it's going to be really fun to talk about. One thing that when you were talking about, when you were learning pattern making and there wasn't this nomenclature around, full bust adjustments or full seat adjustment and things like that. I think one reason for that is when you're making patterns for a commercial context, unless you're making custom clothing, which I know you've done as well, then you're not adjusting a pattern for a full bust. You're not adjusting a pattern for all these variations in humans because you're making something for a standard fit model. And so I think that's where a lot of this nomenclature has come from in the home sewing world, because you are adjusting the pattern to fit this, I don't want to, well, I guess just a variation, like a change from what is the median, what is the norm. And when I say norm, I just mean like the average that the pattern is made for.
Well, and I think a lot of people who were like me, who like had this like background in like ready to wear and learning pattern making that way, and then make a switch to custom somewhere along the line. I think I just had to take what I knew to be true about pattern making and making three-dimensional objects and just apply it. And I just did what I saw. Put the muslin on the client and, could see, oh yeah, it's like really pulling. There's a lot of strain across the bust. I can see that she needs fullness there. I can see that the bust is hiking up the waistline, so I need a little extra length, and kind of seeing the symptoms and then kind of working from there was the way that made sense to my brain. And then I was able, once I came to the sewing world, home sewing world, I kind of saw like, oh yeah, cool. This like full bust adjustment just kind of like takes care of like all those issues instead of me like carving away at the pattern until it was perfect, which works too.
Yeah. Well, this was an awesome discussion. So I just want to quickly recap what we came up with for our tips for getting a fit that you like while still, I guess, maintaining your sanity. So the first tip is just don't let perfect be the enemy of good. And by that we mean just don't expect something that you're not going to be able to achieve with the resources you have. So basically, don't expect that you can get the sort of fit that you might get from, say, a knit garment when you're sewing a woven garment. So be sure not to get too wrapped up in trying to get things perfect and removing every single wrinkle. The second tip was to look at the clothing that you have and that you love and find something that has a similar fit to what you're making, and take a look at that to help you determine what ease and measurements you need, what kind of fabric you might want to use, and those sorts of details. Be sure to differentiate the feelings that you have about fit and the feelings that you have about your body, and just get clear in your own mind about where these thoughts are coming from and what you're really critiquing when you're critiquing the fit. Choose your school of thought on fitting and choose the method that just works for you and that appeals to you. You could try out a few of them and see what works for you, and stick with that for a while and see if you can kind of master that before trying other methods. And then if you need help with figuring out what kind of style of fitting, be sure to listen to the next couple episodes. We're going to go over some of that and talk about fitting even more in the next couple episodes of Seamwork Radio. So I'm looking forward to that, Haley. So if you like this episode, be sure to leave us a review. We had one review here from Pick112, and she said, "This podcast goes well beyond sewing to discuss thoughtful creativity," which I love. That's really sweet. Thank you so much to that person, Pick112. And that's it for us today. So I hope you guys have enjoyed this, and I hope you stick around for the next couple of weeks to learn even more about fitting, and check out our new Fit with Confidence class on the Seamwork Classroom. We would love to see you there. And if you enjoyed this podcast, be sure to leave us a review. We would super, super appreciate it. We'd love to hear from you and hear what you're enjoying about the show. So whether you're using Apple Podcasts or Spotify, just leave us a review and let us know. And we will see you next week.
Bye.
Bye.
Seamwork Radio is brought to you by the Seamwork community, and you can find us at seamwork.com. If you have a story to share, send us an email at podcast@seamwork.com. We'd especially love to hear stories from those whose experiences often get left out of the conversation, whether because of race, gender identity, sexual orientation, disability, age, or any other reason. Again, that's podcast@seamwork.com. You can find us on Instagram at Seamwork and Seamwork Video on YouTube. We'd love to invite you to join us at seamwork.com. We have an amazing community there, as well as new sewing patterns and classes each month for members. Podcast listeners can get 50% off our unlimited membership, which gets you unlimited downloads from our library of over 150 wardrobe-building sewing patterns. Just visit seamwork.com/go/podcast50. You can also find that link in the show notes. And if you like this podcast, please consider giving us a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts or the podcast app of your choice. It really helps other people to find the show so they can hear these stories too. Thanks for joining us, and we'll be back with you soon. I'm Sari Mitnick, and this is Seamwork Radio.